Good morning to you all. Thanks very much for taking the time to come and see us today. I'm a fire engineer of some 20 years now, but actually been in the construction industry for just over 30 years, and I've seen some change in that time. But I think it would be fair to say that the most change I've seen in a space of time has been in the last 2 years, particularly obviously since the Grenfell Tower fire. The whole of the construction industry, as a result of it, has seen the first steps of change in a new approach to the design and the construction and the management of fire safety, particularly in residential buildings. What I wanted to do with this session is to explore the key changes and consider the implications on fire safety, but also some of the implications on smoke ventilation. So what have the key changes and drivers been? I think everyone will have heard of the Hackitt report. That was an independent review of the building regulations and fire safety that was commissioned by the government following the Grenfell Tower fire. The report, carried out by Dame Judith Hackitt, was published in May last year. In response to the fire and the Hackitt report, the government set up the Building a Safer Future programme, and there have been some recent new building regulations as a result of that, and I'm sure there'll be some future new building regulations, some of which have been consulted on as we're here today. So the Hackitt report, summed up in a few sentences in terms of Dame Judith's findings. Ignorance and indifference. So I think that's about the interpretation and the application of the building regulations and the guidance, the knowledge and competency of the guidance to the building regulations, and perhaps taking it as seriously as it should be. She found that there was a lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities, and that was through from the client through to the developers and contractors, the designers, and the people managing and managing the occupied buildings. Inadequate regulatory oversight and enforcement tools. So that's really talking about the building control bodies and perhaps the fire service and their role in delivering safe buildings, and perhaps there not been enough teeth in the building regulations and the Building Act to be able to make sure that they are properly applied and delivered. And then insufficient focus on delivering the best quality building possible, and that's a difficult one. There's a lot of focus, I think, on the speed of delivery and profit in the construction of new buildings. Inevitably so, the new buildings are built as a business. So those are the key findings that she identified. In all, the Hackitt report made 53 recommendations, all of which the government has said that they're going to implement, and in fact they do plan to go further than just those recommendations. Some of the key recommendations, though, that I think will resonate with some people here in the room today and will be of direct interest: the introduction of a new single building safety regulator. It was referred to as a joint competent authority in the Hackitt report, but the government are referring to it now as a single building safety regulator. The proposal for that is for that to be made up of 3 bodies: local authority building standards, previously referred to as local authority building control, the London Fire Brigade or the local fire authority, and the health and safety executive. I think the health and safety executive have been brought in particularly because of the success of the CDM regulations. It's been proposed to introduce statutory gateways, 3 of them. These are gateways that you can't pass through before you satisfy the JCA that the building is going to be built properly. So the first of those that planning. There's the need to, as part of the planning application, submit a fire safety statement, make sure that the fire brigade are consulted with, and make sure that the access and facilities for the fire brigade around the site and for the building are going to be adequate. A safety case review. So in future, people responsible for fire safety within buildings are going to have to make a case for the safety of the building, and that's going to have to be reviewed. And that's going to be for at the planning stage for Gateway 1, for Gateway 2 before you can start construction, and for Gateway 3 before the building can be occupied. And then finally, the words that everyone's been hearing, the golden thread. I think we all know about that, and that's the capture of information about the building that can be used through its life in a digital way, so that it's accessible for everyone, can be readily updated, so it's a live document through the life of the building. So the MHCLG have been responsible for responding to the Hackitt review. The government's proposing a new building and fire safety system which puts residents' safety at its heart. New building regulations have been introduced prohibiting the use of nearly all combustible materials in the external walls of buildings, residential buildings taller than 18 metres. And there's a good chance that that's going to be extended to include other high-risk buildings in the future. Approved Document B has recently been republished. The objective of that was to provide clearer advice on how to meet the fire safety requirements of the building regulations. And there's currently a consultation on reducing the threshold for the provision of sprinklers in flats. There was a consultation earlier in the year. We're currently waiting feedback. The MHCLG are in the process of analysing that feedback, but the proposals were in 5 areas. So the scope of the new regime, it would apply to new residential buildings and existing residential buildings when they're altered. It wants to set out that the duty holders have very clear responsibilities through a building's design, construction, and occupation. So that's responsibilities for the client, the developer, the designers, the contractor, and the people that manage the building during occupation. They want to give residents a stronger voice in the system, making sure that they're not ignored. They want to create a transparent process for receiving complaints and dealing with them, so that the residents can see what's happening about the fire safety standards in their building. We've already mentioned the need for a new regulator of building safety, and the need for strengthened enforcement and sanctions, so that the regulations and the application of them they've actually got teeth and mean something. So I mentioned earlier there's a consultation currently on reducing the threshold for sprinklers in flats. That closed on the 28th of November, and it's certainly something that I'll be responding to. The proposals cover 3 areas. The main area is to reduce the height at which sprinklers are installed in buildings that are used as flats. There are a couple of secondary areas that it's looking at in terms of improving wayfinding and evacuation alert systems. So the sprinkler threshold, the plan is to reduce it to 18 metres in flats. This proposal is a result of the MHCLG's call for evidence last year, when there was a large majority of the comments that were in favour of reducing that threshold. In fact, I've heard recent comments saying that some people would like to see it reduced even further to 11 metres, which I think would be in line with Wales and Scotland. Clearly, the installation of the the sprinkler systems in so many more buildings is going to have an effect on the sprinkler industry, and there's a 6-month transition proposed to give the industry a chance to get up to speed with that. It's only going to apply to new buildings. So the vast majority of the housing stock, blocks of flats that are over 18 metres are existing, and it's not intended that it will apply to those. That's going to be dealt with, I think, by the safety case review that's going to come in place, and that will look at whether sprinklers are needed to be retrospectively installed in those buildings. Sprinklers are very, very beneficial in reducing the risk from fire. I don't think anyone would argue with that. The government have put some statistics in there in terms of the benefits of it based on a BRE study. They've not mentioned which one it is, but I think they were talking about somewhere in the region of 50 to 70% reduction in injuries and deaths. Obviously, that's across the whole of the housing sector, so the impact of it may be less in blocks of flats, particularly those that have been built to the newer standards anyway for other reasons. Costs-wise, they've made some cost estimates of the likely cost per year of introducing the sprinklers, and that's based on £1,300 to £1,600 pounds per unit, although they do accept that some of those costs might be higher on some developments. It's an interesting point the way they've looked at that, because one of the things that I think they haven't accounted for is in some of these buildings that now have to be sprinklered, there will be other uses in them. For instance, it's very, very common to incorporate retail units in the base of a block of flats. So suddenly, if you build a block of flats that's 19 metres tall with a shop at the bottom of it, then you've got to install sprinklers in that. And that's a very different system, very different type of system than a residential sprinkler system, and it's a much more significant cost. In terms of improving wayfinding, this is mostly about firefighting, so that firefighters, when they're tackling a fire, can be aware of what level they're in the building. There's 3 proposals for that. There's a simple proposal of incorporating vinyl numbers on the landing of each floor in the staircase. The secondary proposal is to use photoluminescent signs, and the third proposal is to use internally illuminated emergency lighting signs. The third proposal that they've made, and I believe this has already been adopted in Scotland, is to incorporate an evacuation alert system. Now, this is to give the fire brigade a chance to evacuate the whole building in the event that a fire situation demands that it's necessary. There's a few concerns about this. Firstly, the evacuation strategy currently for blocks of flats is defend in place, and for that reason the stairs aren't designed to be wide enough for everyone to evacuate simultaneously, so there may be some queuing on the stairs if that happens. Secondly, smoke ventilation systems are generally designed for one door to be opened at a time, and we could find ourselves in a situation where multiple doors are opened, reducing the effectiveness of the ventilation system. So these are all things that would have to be looked at if this is to be introduced. So the construction industry hasn't stood still during the process of change, and I've certainly witnessed many stakeholders within the industry, including designers, developers and contractors and building operators, implementing their own new measures to address the problems. Some examples of those. So very early on after the Grenfell Tower fire, many developers were already looking at how they could incorporate safer external wall constructions in their new buildings. That was mostly focused around the combustibility of insulation. Many developers have taken the decision to install sprinklers at a lower height already, typically 18 metres. So there's many developers already actually meeting the proposed consultation. I think one of the benefits of installing sprinklers at a lower height, or taking the early decision to do so, is it has increased design flexibility. So we've been able to do other things with buildings as a result of having the sprinklers in there at a lower height. But whether we'll have that flexibility in the future, if the approved document is changed to make them come in at a lower height, who knows? Interestingly, whereas Regulation 7 for combustible materials is mandatory, which we'll come on to in a moment, they're planning to introduce the reduction in sprinkler height in approved document B. Now, of course, that's guidance, so it may still be possible to develop a case to comply with the building regulations without putting them in certain circumstances. We've also seen developers and contractors develop tighter processes during construction. So they're making much more onerous demands on installers of fire stopping materials to keep records. They're keeping their own records, having their own check sheets and gateways to pass through before the building can be closed up and the fire stopping products concealed forever. They've also been increasing the scope of work of fire engineers. Typically, fire engineers would write a fire strategy during the design stages, get it approved, and that would be the end of their appointment. But we're seeing many developers and contractors now extending the service of fire engineers to provide an inspection service during construction to confirm the quality of fire stopping products. We've seen a change in the approval process as well, and that's had quite a big impact. So London Fire Brigade have been requiring all fire engineering proposals to be fully checked by the building control body before consultation. After all, the building control body administer compliance with the building regulations, so it's reasonable for them to do so, particularly with the resources that they have. As a result of this, building control bodies, because they don't have the level of expertise often to be able to review that sort of information, are employing third-party fire engineers to do so. This is resulting in lots of differences of opinions, and that's affecting the approval process. Building control bodies and London Fire Brigade are taking a far more stringent approach in their application of the guidance. So, for example, where previously it's been possible to build a basement car park without sprinklers because of the guidance in approved document B that says that it's not necessary to install sprinklers in car parks that are mechanically ventilated because they're perceived to be a low risk. Because of some notable fire incidents recently, they're now applying the application and the interpretation of the guidance far more literally. So they're now requesting sprinklers to be installed within basement car parks. Now that has a big issue because that's a very different type of sprinkler system again to a residential system, so you're having to install a completely new system just to protect one part of the building, and that comes at a high cost. Timing of the comments has also been an issue. They've often come very, very late in the process when it's actually very difficult to make the sort of changes that they're requesting. If they came much earlier in the process, then there'd be much more chance to consider them and find a way of implementing them. So I mentioned earlier that there's some new building regulations that have been introduced. The key regulation that's changed is Regulation 7. This was introduced at the end of last year, and there was a 2-month delay before it came into effect. So it affected all buildings started after the 21st of February 2019. The essence of the regulation is that it prohibits the use of combustible materials within the external walls of relevant buildings. It also refers to things like specified attachments, which I'll come on to now. So relevant buildings include all buildings that are more than 18 metres tall and contain at least one dwelling, so a flat or a dwelling house potentially where you've got some kind of maisonette type arrangement, contains an institution, so that's potentially a hospital or some kind of care facility, or contains a room for other residential purposes. So it can mean student accommodation as well, but it doesn't mean a hostel or a hotel or a boarding house. Specified attachments are controlled in the same way, and the definition of that includes balconies, brise-soleil, and solar panels attached to the wall. There are some exemptions. There's a list of exemptions to the requirements. Cavity trays between two leaves of masonry. It's very unusual to build a building more than 18 metres tall having two leaves of masonry. It's usually some form of lightweight construction using SFS and plasterboard. So it's not much of an exemption really. Door frames and doors, they're exempt. Electrical installations, you can read the list. It's all fairly clear while they're relatively small components or low risk because of the location that they're installed within the building. Interestingly, thermal breaks for compliance with Part L, they are exempt, but they need to be kept as small as possible, and they're not allowed to breach compartment walls. Window frames and glass is a good one, which we'll come on to in a moment. So here are some of the challenges. So traditionally, we're used to the technical guidance for compliance with the building regulations to be functional, i.e. you've got to achieve a reasonable standard of safety. However, Regulation 7 is, as it says, a regulation, and it's mandatory. So there's no flexibility at all, other than in the interpretation of the regulation, to do something else, unless you go for some form of dispensation or relaxation. We've seen the limited definitions that they help with interpretation, but they're not really definitive. And we're still finding there are times where we're having to ask the building control body what their view is on what a particular item is. Laminated glass in a window is exempt, but not if it's in a balcony. In my opinion, it's probably still quite a low risk in a balcony, but because the guidance, because the regulation is mandatory, you have no flexibility at all to provide a technical case for doing something different. We've mentioned about balconies, but I was at an event last week where the building control body that was there presenting on the evening, they raised the opinion that where you've got terraces on a building, that they would treat them as balconies, where those terraces were accessible by residents. That's an interesting extension of the interpretation of a balcony, I think. But if you've got a building control body that's very fixed in that view, there's effectively nothing that you can do about it. Cavity trays. The big issue with that is that there currently isn't a product on the market that meets the requirements of not being non-combustible, the Class A and the A1 and A2 ratings. That's also acceptable to warranty companies. So stainless steel is probably the only material that you could use in that situation, but I understand that the warranty companies aren't happy with the performance of stainless steel in the long term, mainly down to the jointing, being able to joint it during construction and for it to act as it's supposed to. We've also had a new approved document published just at the end of last month. The purpose of this wasn't to change the technical requirements, it was to rewrite it in a language, as the government are currently doing with other documents, in a way that it's more in line with the new style for MHCLG, so that it's easier to understand. So although the technical recommendations haven't changed, it's very likely that the drafting of the text could lead to different interpretations if they've changed some of the wording. The other significant part is that flats have now moved to Volume 1. Previously Volume 1 was just dwelling houses, but it's now covering all residential. I say all residential, I mean just dwellings. So in spite of this new guidance, it seems it may have been rushed out without thinking about everything, because it was published at the in August, I think actually beginning of July, and came into effect the 30th of August, and then earlier this month it was temporarily withdrawn while they addressed some comments on the performance of fire dampers. I understand that it's been reintroduced as late as yesterday. Too late for me to update the presentation, but yeah, I think that's almost unheard of. It's unprecedented in the 30 years that I've been in the construction industry. So I thought I'd end by summarising some of the problems and the challenges that I think we've got coming up for us in building. The introduction of the statutory gateways. This is going to increase the duration of the development programme. What's going to be interesting is to see whether the single regulator is going to exercise some degree of flexibility in allowing certain parts of the building design to be signed off and then allowing construction to start, or whether they'll insist on all aspects of the fire safety building design being completed, and time for them to review and approve it before you can start work on site. Currently it's normal practice to do enabling works and do the foundation works and start coming out the ground while you're still finalising the fire safety design. The other question is it going to be possible to get a safety certificate at the end of the job to allow partial occupation? That's, I think, a question that's going to have to be answered at some point. I think the introduction of the single building safety regulator is going to reduce design flexibility. There won't be any competition, so they haven't got alternatives to go to. The way that things certainly seem to be going with the application of regulations, they're becoming far more strict, and it's going to increase approval costs. You're going from one body dealing with the approval to introducing the fire brigade and the health and safety executive into that process, and the instruction is that they need to be self-financing. So inevitably it's going to increase the costs. We've just talked about the consultation on reducing the sprinkler height. One of the things that I can see is that with shorter buildings being sprinkled, we're not going to be able to use them in all circumstances to help create some additional design flexibility. And Regulation 7, it's mandatory, still subject to interpretation, has resulted in more limited design flexibility. As I mentioned, in the case of cavity trays, a compliant product isn't available. Glazing is acceptable in windows and doors, but of course in balconies you have to use laminated glass for safety purposes. Laminated glass is a sheet of plastic to control it breaking, so that doesn't comply with Regulation 7. So that's a big issue, because glazed balconies are used commonly in construction. So just to conclude, I think it's still very early to predict with any certainty what the new building and fire safety system is going to look like. The objective improving in quality is clear, and we've got many challenges to face over the next few years to improve our approach to design, construction and management of fire safety if we're going to deliver better building quality. Thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. As I understand it, there's no timescale yet for the introduction of either the single body regulator or the gateway process. I did read that there are some early adopters who are trialling part of it, so there's people in the industry, organisations in the industry who are working together to try and trial some of these new proposals to see how they're working. the plan is that you'll join the gateway process at the relevant point. So if you're already in construction, the first gateway that you'll have to go through is gateway 3. If you're already in planning, the first gateway will be gateway 2. And I think my advice would be, given that there's so little information around about how and when it will be introduced, the best plan is to start preparing as much as you can now by recording and producing as much information as possible on the building, so that when it comes to preparing the safety case, you're not having to go back retrospectively and look at it. When it comes in, I understand it will affect anything that's under construction or in the planning process. It's just that you join the process at the relevant gateway. Yeah, and I think if you look at the way that recent changes have been introduced, so the new Regulation 7, there was a very short transitional period of effectively 2 months, whereas if you had a building regulations application, even if you had a building regulations application in, if you hadn't started by the 21st of February, then effectively you had to update your external wall designs to comply with the latest regulations. So I think we can expect less transitional grace in future. I do think there'll be a big push in this consultation process to reduce the trigger height to 11 metres. I think, and that would be in line with what I understand the arrangements are in Scotland and Wales. I do think there will be a place for fire engineering. If you look at the way that it's currently used, it's very uncommon to build a block of flats that has compliant travel distances in the common corridors, or a code-compliant ventilation system, smoke ventilation system. So it's usual to introduce fire engineering to design the performance of the smoke ventilation system to protect the common escape routes. I do think that there'll be less opportunity in other areas. So we've already talked about not sprinklering commercial areas within residential buildings. We've been able to do that in the past and justify it. In the last 2 years, we've had to provide much more rigorous justification for it, but I don't think in future we're going to have that opportunity. I don't get the impression that we won't be able to do that. The use of fire engineering to develop enhanced smoke ventilation systems to protect the common escape routes is well established and accepted. We're finding that with the involvement of new bodies in the checking process of that, we're getting different opinions. Some are alternative, some are more rigorous. So there may be a need to revisit the guidance on the design of those systems at some point in the future to reflect the new wider thinking. But I think that I've not seen anything to suggest that won't be feasible in the future.